have no regrets.
So when I saw this moment, I was just thinking about myself and my a lot of emotions and grieving that I have.
The internet didn't just react, it erupted. Within hours, clips, screenshots, and fragmented audio started circulating across social platforms, each one adding another layer of confusion to an already volatile conversation. And at the center of it all, one name kept coming up again and again: Candace Owens. According to what she has publicly suggested in recent discussions, there are now serious unanswered questions surrounding private matters linked to Charlie Kirk before his passing, including claims about a possible DNA test that was allegedly discussed in confidence. That single detail alone was enough to send online communities into a full spiral. Because if even a fraction of what is being said is true, then the implications go far beyond personal drama. They touch everything: trust, legacy, relationships, and the carefully constructed public image that surrounded one of the most closely watched political figures in conservative media. Candace, in her usual direct and unfiltered style, has not backed away from the conversation. Instead, she has doubled down on the idea that people deserve clarity, not silence. She has pointed to what she describes as missing context and selective storytelling, suggesting that the full picture of Charlie's final private concerns has never been properly addressed in public. And that is exactly what has ignited the firestorm. Supporters say she is asking the questions others are too afraid to raise. Critics argue she is pushing speculation into dangerous territory without verified proof. Meanwhile, online audiences are caught in the middle, trying to separate emotional storytelling from factual reality in a situation that keeps evolving by the hour. But what makes this moment different is not just what is being said, it is the reaction around it. Every new claim seems to trigger a louder response. Every denial fuels more suspicion, and every attempt to clarify only deepens the divide. Now, with tensions rising and narratives clashing, one question is echoing across social media louder than anything else. Was there really something Charlie Kirk confided privately that has never been fully revealed? Or has the internet once again turned fragments of conversation into a full-blown storm of interpretation? Either way, the conversation is no longer quiet, and whatever the truth is, it is now at the center of a controversy that refuses to slow down. The conversation didn't start overnight. What people are seeing now is only the loudest moment of a story that has been building slowly in the background for years, through interviews, public appearances, social media clips, and fragments of private life that were never meant to collide in such a public way. At the center of it all is a tightly connected world of political influence, media presence, and personal relationships that have long been under public observation. Charlie Kirk, as a well-known conservative political commentator and founder of Turning Point USA, spent years building a highly visible platform focused on activism, youth engagement, and political messaging. Every part of that identity existed in the spotlight, where supporters followed closely and critics watched even closer. Erica Kirk, meanwhile, often appeared in public discussions as part of that same ecosystem, presented through interviews, social appearances, and online narratives that emphasized faith, family values, and stability. Over time, a specific public image formed around her, one that many supporters associated with discipline, devotion, and a carefully structured personal life. But as is often the case with public figures, the image people see is only one layer. Over the years, fragments of older interviews, resurfaced clips, and social media discussions began circulating in online spaces, creating a parallel narrative that some viewers started interpreting differently. Old connections were revisited, timelines were re-examined, and past relationships were brought back into public discussion, not always with full context, but with growing curiosity. This is where Candace Owens enters the current wave of attention. Candace has long been a polarizing figure in political commentary circles, known for speaking directly, often controversially, and refusing to avoid sensitive topics. In recent discussions, she has suggested that there are unresolved questions surrounding private matters connected to Charlie Kirk's later years, including what she described as concerns he allegedly carried privately before his passing. One of the most discussed points emerging from this narrative is the idea that Charlie may have considered a private DNA test related to personal family matters. This claim, as it circulates online, is not presented with publicly verified documentation, but rather through secondhand interpretations of commentary and alleged insider conversations being discussed in digital spaces. Still, the moment this idea entered the conversation, it changed the tone entirely. Because DNA testing, even as a concept, introduces a level of seriousness that goes far beyond typical public speculation. It implies questions of trust, identity, and private uncertainty that are deeply personal and, if true, would never have been intended for public consumption. As discussions expanded online, different communities began forming competing interpretations. One side of the audience sees Candace's comments as a call for transparency, a push to bring hidden concerns into the open so that unanswered questions do not remain buried. In their view, silence only increases speculation, and addressing claims directly is the only way to prevent misinformation from growing unchecked. Another side sees the situation very differently. They argue that circulating unverified personal claims about private family matters crosses a line, especially when those claims involve sensitive topics and individuals who are not actively speaking on them publicly. From this perspective, the entire discussion becomes less about truth and more about narrative escalation. Between these two extremes, the online space has become increasingly fractured. Social media platforms, podcasts, commentary channels, and discussion forums have all contributed to a rapidly expanding ecosystem of interpretations. Short clips are reposted without full context. Statements are paraphrased, reframed, and requoted in ways that sometimes amplify emotion more than accuracy. And as engagement grows, so does the intensity of the conversation. At the same time, Turning Point USA itself remains a highly visible organization with strong ideological influence, meaning that any internal or external controversy connected to its leadership naturally attracts attention far beyond typical celebrity discourse. When politics, personality, and public image overlap, even small details can quickly become magnified. This is part of what makes the current discussion so volatile. It is not happening in isolation. It is happening inside a highly charged environment where political, identity, media narratives, and personal relationships are already deeply intertwined. As a result, every new claim is interpreted through multiple lenses at once: political, emotional, and personal. Supporters focus on loyalty and legacy. Critics focus on contradictions and inconsistencies. Neutral observers try to piece together what is real, what is speculation, and what is simply internet amplification. Candace Owens' involvement adds another layer of complexity because of her visibility and her history of challenging mainstream narratives. Whether people agree or disagree with her, her statements tend to travel quickly across platforms, often gaining momentum before any clarification or context can catch up. And that is exactly what has happened here. A single idea, that there may have been private concerns involving a DNA test, has now evolved into a much larger online conversation about trust, transparency, and the boundaries between public life and private reality. But even with all the noise, one thing remains consistent. There is no single agreed-upon version of events circulating online. Instead, there are multiple overlapping narratives competing for attention, each shaped by perspective rather than confirmed documentation. And as these narratives continue to spread, the gap between perception and verified fact only grows wider. Which is why the situation has now reached a point where every new comment, every clipped interview, and every interpreted statement is being analyzed with extreme intensity. Because in moments like this, people are no longer just listening to what is said. They are searching for what they believe is missing. The shift happened fast. What started as scattered online commentary about private tensions and unanswered questions quickly evolved into something far more intense, a full-blown narrative war unfolding across social media platforms. Every new clip, every resurfaced quote, and every interpretation of past interviews began feeding into a larger story that no one seemed able to control anymore. At the center of the storm was Candace Owens' continued commentary, which many online users interpreted as a push toward exposing what she described as uncomfortable truths surrounding private matters linked to Charlie Kirk's personal life before his passing. Her statements, often indirect but emotionally charged, became fuel for an already volatile discussion, and then came the moment that changed the tone completely. A claim began circulating online, suggesting that Charlie Kirk had allegedly expressed private concerns about conducting a DNA test related to family matters. Not as a public accusation, but as a personal step meant to resolve internal doubts and find clarity. This detail, whether accurate or misinterpreted, instantly became the most explosive point in the entire conversation. Because a DNA test isn't just another rumor point. It implies uncertainty at the most personal level. And once that idea entered the public space, it reframed everything that had been discussed before it. Suddenly, earlier conversations, past interviews, and resurfaced clips were being reanalyzed under a new lens. People weren't just watching for what was being said. They were looking for hidden meaning in everything that had been said before. This is where the first major twist took shape. Online commentators began pointing to what they described as inconsistencies in timelines and shifts in public narrative surrounding key relationships and events. Old interviews were clipped and reposted. Previous statements were compared side by side. Even casual remarks from years earlier were being interpreted as potential clues. Nothing new had been officially confirmed, but the perception of contradiction was enough to change how audiences engaged with the story. At the same time, Candace's tone in public discussions became more pointed. She did not directly confirm private details, but her insistence that not everything has been fully addressed was interpreted by supporters as an indirect confirmation that there was more beneath the surface than what had been publicly acknowledged. Critics, however, saw something very different. To them, the entire situation was becoming an example of narrative escalation, where incomplete information, emotional interpretation, and selective clips were being woven together into a storyline that appeared larger and more structured than the evidence actually supported. This divide created the first real conflict in the broader public reaction. On one side, audiences believed they were witnessing the slow unveiling of a hidden truth, something that had been contained or softened over time. On the other side, audiences saw a growing spiral of speculation that risked turning personal tragedy and private life into entertainment-driven narrative building. But regardless of which side people fell on, the momentum was undeniable. Then came the second layer of tension. Online discussions began expanding beyond just Candace and Erica Kirk, pulling in names connected to Turning Point USA's broader network. Former staff, media figures, and political affiliates were all being mentioned in threads attempting to map out who knew what, when they knew it, and how deeply they were involved in the internal environment being described. This is where interpretation began replacing clarity. Small moments were reinterpreted as symbolic. Old interactions were reframed as suspicious. Even routine professional relationships were being analyzed as potential indicators of deeper conflict. The story was no longer confined to one relationship or one claim. It had expanded into an ecosystem of interconnected assumptions. And that's when the first major twist fully locked into place. A resurfaced discussion began circulating, suggesting that Charlie Kirk at some point had allegedly sought private answers about his personal life, but never fully made those concerns public. This detail, whether accurate or distorted, was quickly tied back to the DNA test narrative, creating the impression of a hidden internal struggle that had never been openly addressed. Once that idea took hold, everything shifted again. Because now the story was no longer just about what people were saying after his passing. It was about what he may have believed or questioned while he was still alive. That change in framing intensified the emotional weight of the entire conversation. It moved the narrative from external commentary into internal speculation about private thoughts, private doubts, and private decisions that were never documented publicly. At the same time, Candace Owens' position in the conversation became even more controversial. Supporters framed her as someone pushing against silence, someone attempting to bring clarity to a situation they believe has too many unanswered gaps. They argue that if private concerns existed, ignoring them only deepens confusion and leaves space for misinformation to spread unchecked. Critics counter that elevating unverified private claims into public discussion risks distorting reality and turning speculation into perceived fact. They argue that once audiences begin accepting interpretation as evidence, the line between truth and narrative becomes dangerously blurred. But neither side slowed the momentum. If anything, the conflict escalated further when discussions shifted toward the idea of control. Specifically, who controls the narrative around Charlie Kirk's legacy and how that narrative is being shaped in real time. Some online users began suggesting that competing interests were trying to influence how events were being interpreted publicly. Others dismissed that entirely, arguing that what was really happening was a predictable cycle of online speculation amplified by algorithm-driven engagement. Still, the perception of conflict remained, and perception in this case became more powerful than verification. As clips circulated and commentary videos multiplied, audiences began forming stronger emotional positions. The conversation stopped being passive observation and became active interpretation. People were no longer just judging, they were choosing sides. This is where the first twist truly solidified. What initially looked like isolated claims about private matters had now evolved into a layered narrative involving alleged internal doubts, resurfaced past relationships, organizational tension, and competing interpretations of silence versus transparency. And at the center of it all remained one unresolved idea: that there may have been private concerns Charlie Kirk never publicly addressed, which are now being reinterpreted through the lens of everything happening after his passing. Whether that idea is accurate, exaggerated, or entirely misread, it has become the anchor point of the entire discussion. Because once people believe there is missing information, every new detail stops being neutral. It becomes evidence, or contradiction, depending on who is interpreting it. And that is exactly what pushed this situation from simple online discussion into a fully developed public controversy with no clear endpoint in sight. The moment the conversation crossed a certain threshold, it stopped behaving like ordinary online commentary. What had begun as scattered speculation and resurfaced clips now started to resemble a coordinated wave of interpretations building on top of each other in real time. Every new post, every podcast clip, and every reaction video added another layer to a story that was already becoming increasingly difficult to separate from emotion, assumption, and fragmented context. And then the escalation phase truly began. It started with renewed attention on Candace Owens' public remarks. In her usual direct style, she continued to imply that there were unresolved questions surrounding private matters linked to Charlie Kirk's final years. Particularly references online had been making to a possible private DNA test discussion. While she did not provide verified documentation, the way she framed her commentary left space for interpretation, and that space quickly filled with speculation. Online audiences amplified those statements almost instantly. Short clips were reposted with dramatic captions. Edited segments circulated without full context. Commentary channels began stitching together timelines that mixed public appearances, old interviews, and alleged insider claims into one continuous narrative. And as engagement grew, so did the intensity of belief on all sides. For some viewers, this was confirmation that something significant had been hidden or softened over time. For others, it was another example of how quickly incomplete information can evolve into a structured narrative that feels more solid than the evidence behind it. But the escalation didn't stop at interpretation. A second wave of discussion began focusing on what people called behavioral inconsistencies in public appearances connected to individuals within Charlie Kirk's professional and personal circle. Clips resurfaced showing emotional speeches, offhand comments, and staged public moments that viewers began analyzing frame by frame. Small gestures were magnified. Tone of voice was scrutinized. Timing of statements was questioned. And suddenly, what once looked like normal public communication was being reinterpreted through a completely different lens. This is where the so-called shocking reveal phase of the narrative began to form. Not through a single confirmed event, but through the accumulation of perceived contradictions. One of the most widely circulated points was the idea that Charlie Kirk had allegedly carried private concerns related to family matters that were never fully disclosed to the public. Online users tied this idea back to earlier claims about a possible DNA test discussion, suggesting that this was part of a broader internal struggle rather than a single isolated incident. Again, none of this was independently verified, but the narrative structure made it feel cohesive to many viewers. And that cohesion is what drove escalation. Once people believe separate fragments connect, they begin treating the entire structure as one continuous story. And in this case, that structure was growing rapidly. At the same time, Candace Owens' involvement continued to act as a catalyst. Supporters interpreted her comments as confirmation that deeper issues existed beneath the public surface. Critics argued she was fueling speculation without grounding it in confirmed evidence. But regardless of perspective, her influence on the direction of the conversation was undeniable. Then came the most intense shift in tone. Online discussions began focusing heavily on the idea of silence, specifically why certain individuals involved in the broader narrative had not publicly addressed the growing wave of claims in a direct and detailed way. This silence itself became part of the story. For some users, silence was interpreted as caution, legal sensitivity, or respect for privacy. For others, silence was interpreted as avoidance, or even confirmation that there were details too sensitive to address publicly. This divide pushed the conversation deeper into emotional territory. Because once silence becomes part of the narrative, it is no longer neutral. It becomes evidence depending on who is interpreting it. And that is where the shocking reveal framing intensified. Another layer emerged when older content resurfaced involving past relationships, professional overlaps, and political networking circles connected to individuals around Turning Point USA. These resurfaced materials were not new, but they were being recontextualized under the current wave of speculation. A previously harmless interview clip now looked suspicious to some viewers. A casual photo now became a debated timeline marker. A past professional connection was reinterpreted as something more complex. The escalation was no longer about new information, it was about reinterpretation of old information under a new narrative lens. And that is what made the situation feel like it was constantly expanding. As discussion threads multiplied, so did the emotional tone. People were no longer calmly analyzing, they were reacting, defending, arguing, and drawing conclusions based on partial interpretations. The algorithm amplified the most emotional takes, which in turn shaped what new viewers saw first. This created a feedback loop. More emotion led to more engagement. More engagement led to more visibility. More visibility led to more interpretation, and the cycle kept repeating. At this stage, even neutral observers began noticing how quickly the conversation was shifting away from verifiable information and toward narrative construction. The idea of a hidden truth became central to many discussions, even though no single confirmed source had validated the overarching claims being circulated. Still, the perception of revelation grew stronger, because the human mind tends to connect fragmented patterns into complete stories, especially when those fragments involve public figures, emotional language, and unresolved questions. And that psychological dynamic played a major role in how the escalation unfolded. As the narrative expanded, one of the most discussed ideas was that Charlie Kirk had privately expressed concerns that were never publicly addressed, and that those concerns may have influenced later decisions and tensions within his personal life. This interpretation, repeated across multiple platforms, began to take on a life of its own. Some users described it as a missing piece finally surfacing. Others described it as internet storytelling gone too far. But regardless of stance, the conversation had clearly moved beyond its original scope. What made this phase feel like a shocking reveal to many viewers was not a single confirmed disclosure, but the sensation that multiple disconnected pieces were suddenly being framed as part of one coherent hidden narrative. That sensation is powerful online, because once a narrative feels complete, people begin to believe it even if the foundation remains unverified. And in this case, the sense of completion came from repetition, not confirmation. The escalation also intensified when commentary creators began adding their own interpretations on top of existing claims. Each layer added emotional framing, dramatic pauses, and suggestive language that further blurred the line between observation and implication. By the time the discussion reached its peak, audiences were no longer consuming raw information. They were consuming interpretations of interpretations. And that is where the shocking effect truly emerged. Not from one definitive revelation, but from the accumulation of many partial narratives that, when combined, created the illusion of a larger hidden structure. At this point, the story had fully transitioned from isolated claims into a multi-layered online controversy driven by speculation, emotional response, and constant reinterpretation. And with every new cycle of discussion, the sense of escalation only deepened further. Once the discussion reached peak intensity, the reaction phase unfolded almost instantly across every corner of the internet. What had started as niche commentary and clipped discussions was now a full-scale digital debate, pulling in audiences from political media, podcast communities, commentary channels, and casual social media users who had no prior context but were drawn in by the sheer volume of conversation. And at the center of it all, the reactions were sharply divided. On one side, supporters of Candace Owens framed her involvement as a necessary disruption. In their view, she was not simply commenting on public speculation. She was challenging what they believed were unanswered questions surrounding private matters tied to Charlie Kirk's final years. To them, her willingness to speak openly represented accountability in an environment where silence had allegedly allowed confusion to grow. These viewers frequently described the situation as long overdue transparency, arguing that public figures who build influence also carry responsibility to address unresolved narratives when they spill into public discourse. Many of them echoed the belief that if there were inconsistencies or unanswered concerns in the background, they should not remain hidden behind carefully controlled messaging or institutional silence. On social platforms, this group amplified clips, reposted commentary segments, and built threads attempting to connect timelines, statements, and past interviews into a single structured narrative. Their tone was often confident, even declarative, as if the fragmented information circulating online was already pointing toward a clear conclusion. But the opposing reaction was just as strong and far more critical. Media analysts, political commentators, and general observers warned that the situation was rapidly evolving into a cycle of speculation built on interpretation rather than verified evidence. From their perspective, what was happening was not accountability, but narrative escalation fueled by viral content dynamics. They argued that once emotionally charged claims enter the algorithmic ecosystem of short-form content, they begin to mutate. Clips get trimmed, context disappears, and emotionally compelling interpretations outperform careful explanations. In that environment, even unverified suggestions can begin to feel like established fact simply because they are repeated often enough. This group emphasized caution, repeatedly pointing out that there had been no publicly verified documentation, confirming many of the claims circulating online. They stressed the importance of distinguishing between commentary, rumor, and factual reporting, especially when discussing deeply personal matters involving family dynamics, private relationships, and sensitive allegations. Within this critical audience, there was also concern about the broader cultural impact. Some commentators argued that the situation reflected a larger trend in digital media, where audiences increasingly treat speculation as investigative truth, and where influence can sometimes outweigh evidence in shaping public perception. Meanwhile, within political media circles, the reaction was even more complex. Some commentators avoided directly engaging with the specifics of the claims, instead focusing on the broader implications of public trust, media responsibility, and the difficulty of controlling narratives once they enter the online ecosystem. Others subtly referenced the situation without naming individuals directly, highlighting how quickly internal or private matters can become public talking points once they intersect with high-profile personalities. Podcast communities also played a major role in amplifying the discussion. Clips from long-form conversations were edited into short viral segments, often focusing on emotionally charged moments or strong statements. These clips were then shared across platforms with minimal context, leading to further reinterpretation by audiences who were encountering the material for the first time. As a result, the conversation became increasingly fragmented. Different audiences were effectively reacting to different versions of the same story, depending on which clips, summaries, or commentary they had seen first. And that fragmentation fueled even more disagreement. In online forums and comment sections, discussions became polarized. Some users insisted that the growing list of claims pointed toward a larger hidden pattern involving private tensions, organizational dynamics, and unresolved personal questions. Others repeatedly pushed back, arguing that the entire situation had moved far beyond responsible interpretation and into the territory of viral misinformation shaped by emotional storytelling. Interestingly, even neutral observers noted how quickly the tone of the conversation shifted from curiosity to certainty. Early discussions were filled with questions. Later discussions were filled with conclusions, despite the lack of verified updates or official clarification. This shift is what many analysts pointed to as the defining characteristic of the reaction phase. Not the content of the claims themselves, but the speed at which interpretation hardened into belief across different online communities. Within conservative media audiences specifically, reactions were especially divided. Some viewers expressed discomfort with how internal matters were being discussed publicly, worrying that prolonged controversy could overshadow broader political messaging. Others believed that ignoring or downplaying public speculation would only allow misinformation to grow unchecked. Meanwhile, supporters of Candace Owens continued to push forward the idea that her commentary was uncovering something intentionally left unclear. They framed her involvement as uncomfortable but necessary, suggesting that resistance to her claims was less about evidence and more about protecting established narratives. Critics strongly rejected that framing, arguing that such interpretations risk turning ambiguity into accusation and assumption into belief. As this back and forth intensified, the emotional tone of the entire conversation escalated further. Hashtags trended intermittently, reaction videos gained traction, and engagement-driven commentary continued to shape how new audiences encountered the topic. Every new post added more fuel, even when no new verified information was being introduced. And through all of it, one pattern remained consistent. The lack of a single authoritative clarification left space for competing narratives to grow independently. In that vacuum, perception became reality for different segments of the audience. For some, the situation represented a troubling example of silence creating speculation. For others, it represented a cautionary example of speculation overtaking evidence. And for many simply observing from the outside, it became increasingly difficult to tell where interpretation ended and fact began. By the end of this reaction phase, the conversation was no longer centered on a single claim or individual statement. It had transformed into a broader cultural debate about trust, media influence, the power of online narratives, and the speed at which unverified ideas can evolve into widely discussed truths in digital spaces. And as the intensity continued to build, it became clear that the story was not slowing down. If anything, the reactions themselves had become part of the story. The tension online didn't cool down after Candace's latest wave of statements. It actually tightened like a knot that refused to loosen. Every new clip, every screenshot, every half-heard comment from interviews started getting dissected frame by frame. And the strange part wasn't just what people were saying anymore. It was how quickly everything was escalating without a single confirmed document ever being shown publicly. What really shifted the energy was the sudden contradiction in narratives coming from all sides. On one hand, supporters of Erica were insisting that the entire situation was being twisted out of context, blown up by social media interpretation and selective editing. On the other hand, critics were convinced that too many coincidences were stacking up to ignore. Timelines, interviews, emotional reactions, and the way certain details were being repeatedly referenced but never directly clarified. And in the middle of all this noise, Candace's position became even more polarizing. Her supporters said she was asking the questions no one else had the courage to ask. Her critics said she was fueling speculation that was impossible to verify and dangerous to amplify. But regardless of where people stood, one thing was undeniable. The conversation had completely escaped control. Then came the moment that flipped the tone again. A short, clipped segment from an earlier discussion resurfaced online, one that many viewers claimed they had never fully noticed before. In it, there was a vague reference to private concerns, family uncertainty, and decisions made off camera. No names were directly mentioned, no clear context was provided, but that didn't stop the internet from attaching meaning to every word. Within hours, that single clip was being edited, reposted, slowed down, zoomed in, and paired with old interviews as if people were building a puzzle from fragments that were never designed to fit together. That's when the DNA test narrative, already floating in online speculation, exploded again. Not because anything new was confirmed, but because people started reinterpreting older comments through a completely different lens. A sentence that once sounded casual now sounded loaded. A pause in speech now felt intentional. A glance in an interview now became evidence in comment sections. And that's where things crossed into something unpredictable. Because once people start believing there's hidden meaning behind everything, even silence becomes suspicious. At the same time, another layer was added when a separate clip began circulating, this one showing Candace responding to criticism in a more controlled, measured tone. She didn't double down on details. She didn't confirm anything specific. Instead, she repeatedly emphasized accountability, transparency, and the idea that questions don't disappear just because people are uncomfortable with them. That phrasing alone sent social media into overdrive. Some viewers interpreted it as confidence, like she was standing on something solid but refusing to reveal everything publicly. Others saw it as careful wording, designed to keep attention without crossing legal or factual boundaries. And that split reaction only made the situation more intense. Because now it wasn't just about what was true, it was about what people believed might be true. Then, just when the conversation felt like it couldn't get any louder, a new rumor started spreading in fragmented posts across different platforms. that there were internal disagreements behind the scenes involving who knew what, when certain concerns were first raised, and why some conversations allegedly never made it into public discussion. Nothing was confirmed, nothing was documented, but the timing of the rumor made it stick in people's minds, and that's what created the final shift. The internet stopped treating this like a single controversy and started treating it like a layered story, one where every person involved might be holding a different version of events. Some users even began mapping out timelines of their own, trying to align interviews, public appearances, and statements into a single coherent sequence. But the more they tried to organize it, the more contradictions they found. And that's where the real tension sits now. Because if even half of what people believe online is inaccurate, the entire narrative collapses. But if even a fraction of it turns out to have a foundation in reality, then the story is far from over, and the silence from key voices is only making that uncertainty louder. As of now, no definitive proof has surfaced for the claims being circulated. No verified documents, no confirmed test results, no official statements that settle the matter. Just fragments, reactions, and interpretations fighting for dominance in a space where attention moves faster than truth. But the question that keeps echoing across every platform is no longer about one event or one allegation. It's something much bigger. What happens when a story becomes so widely discussed that people stop waiting for answers and start deciding them for themselves? Because right now, the most powerful force in this entire situation isn't evidence, it's momentum. And once momentum reaches this level, it doesn't just shape opinions anymore. It starts shaping reality. And the next move, whoever makes it first, could change how this entire narrative is understood going forward. But until then, the silence is doing all the talking. Before you click away, take a second and really think about what you've just seen unfold. Because this isn't the kind of story that wraps itself up neatly in a headline or disappears after one viral clip. It keeps evolving. New angles appear, old moments get reinterpreted, and every time the internet thinks it has a clear picture, something else shifts the frame again. And that's exactly why this situation has pulled in so much attention. People aren't just reacting to one moment anymore. They're reacting to a growing web of claims, responses, and interpretations that all seem to point in different directions depending on who you ask. Some believe there are still unanswered questions sitting underneath the surface. Others believe the entire thing is being exaggerated through repetition and online speculation. And most viewers, they're stuck somewhere in the middle, trying to separate emotion from evidence. But here's the part that really matters. In situations like this, the loudest narrative is rarely the final one. The internet moves fast, but truth, real, verifiable truth, moves differently. It takes time, it requires clarity. And most importantly, it requires something that social media rarely gives: patience. So the real question becomes this: how much of what spreads online is actually solid information, and how much of it is interpretation built on top of interpretation? Because once a story reaches this level of attention, every detail starts getting filtered through opinion. Every clip gets re-edited. Every quote gets reframed. And before long, people aren't reacting to facts anymore. They're reacting to versions of facts. That's why it's important to stay aware, stay critical, and avoid rushing into conclusions based on fragments alone. If there's one takeaway from everything circulating right now, it's this: big narratives always attract big assumptions, but assumptions are not answers. And until anything is confirmed through clear, credible sources, all of this remains part of an ongoing public conversation, not a finished case. Still, the discussion isn't slowing down. If anything, it's expanding. More voices are joining in, more interpretations are forming, and more questions are being asked every day. So the next update, whatever it turns out to be, will matter. And when it arrives, it will either reinforce what people believe or completely reshape the way this entire situation is understood. If you want to stay updated as this develops, make sure you're paying attention to how the narrative changes over time, not just the loudest version of it today. Because in stories like this, the biggest shift usually comes when people least expect it.